Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by SurvivingBreastCancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of SurvivingBreastCancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. We have recently launched our MBC Sunday series. Every other Sunday, we are hosting a live webinar series that is also streamed on Facebook on our Facebook page, SurvivingBreastCancer.org. And we talk about all specific topics related to the metastatic breast cancer community. This ranges from dealing with grief, talking to your children about cancer, preparing and estate planning, the difference between palliative care and hospice, etc. So this is just a great series. Obviously, it is specific to MBC, but of course, all stages, all people are always welcome. Today on Breast Cancer Conversations, I am pleased to be continuing the conversation with Matt Whitaker and Abigail Johnston. This is a follow-up from last week's podcast where we talked about end-of-life choices. And one question that I wanted to pull out of that dialogue was the role that medical aid and dying play. Our webinar series is also made possible because of our friends and partnership that we have at Citizen. SurvivingBreastCancer.org and Citizen are joining forces to get you full control over your medical records so you can find better treatment options, including clinical trials. With end-to-end military-grade encryption to keep your data secure, Citizen ensures that you decide who you share your information with. Your privacy comes first. We couldn't be more excited to share this free resource with our community. We encourage you to check out Citizen. And because you heard it here first through SurvivingBreastCancer.org, Breast Cancer Conversations podcast, we have a special URL just for you. You can go to citizen/SBC trials. That's spelled CIITIZEN/SBC trials. I'm not going to lie. Medical aid in dying is a controversial topic, but in today's conversation, we want to focus on end-of-life choices and how to mitigate suffering. Welcome to the conversation.
One of the things that I get asked a lot when I talk to people about my work with Compassion and Choices and this idea of medical aid in dying is that people may have religious objections to the concept itself, that it is, the S word, it's suicide. Since you do have a theology background, would you like to speak to that a little bit, Matt? Because that seems to be one of the most prevalent conversations I have in this space.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And there are people who have, deeply held religious convictions that preclude them from personally ever being interested in something like medical aid in dying because of the feeling that ultimately the giver and taker of life is some type of higher power. However, that person's background names that higher power. And many times this comes into play in kind of more conservative Christian theology. But there are two things that for me, as someone who personally identifies as Christian and who takes theology seriously and study seriously enough that I took out student loans for it. I personally have kind of two thoughts that really have brought me to the place where I'm not only comfortable, but think that this is actually it's a religious imperative for me to advocate for this. And one is that ultimately in the New Testament, which is the Christian book that details the life of Jesus and the time after that prophet, one important kind of piece of what we're taught about his ministry is that throughout his lifetime, anytime someone cried out for help, anytime someone who was suffering spoke, he gave preferential treatment to the person who was suffering. They were the one who ultimately got to speak about this. And when you look at medical aid in dying and how it is that it came about, how it is that it continues to be brought forward, it's not a special interest group or some philosophical ivory tower person who's bringing this up. It's people who are suffering. It's people who are terminally ill and who are saying, I need this. And for me, ultimately, my allegiance is with those who are suffering, if I'm going to follow that example that I see in the Bible. And it doesn't really matter what I think about it. I need to make sure that I'm with those who are suffering, and that if this is what they're crying out for, that's what I'm advocating for. The other piece, just to piggyback on some of our conversations about medical technology, is that many people say, well, that's playing God, or that's interfering with the natural law of the world. Well, guess what? Like, we're there. That's how we're able to live longer with serious illness. That's how we're able to spend more time with our families when we're facing things that at one point were a death sentence. That's how we're able to continue to innovate. That's how we're facing a pandemic right now, and seeing some type of light at the end of the tunnel because of amazing advances in ways that we are able to, in some ways, fight against the natural forces of the world that are putting things in motion. So, when we talk about that, we're there, and with medical technology, people are living longer and longer, but oftentimes facing more acute suffering at the end of life from illnesses. And that's one of the many reasons why people are crying out for this option. So, to me, it's a inconsistent argument when someone says something like that about this, because we are already kind of in that spot. And so now it's about, how do we err on the side of compassion? How do we listen to those that are suffering? How do we take ourselves out of the equation and make sure that person is receiving the preference? And I could preach on that all day. It's Sunday, but that's the Cliff Notes version of it.
Thank you for explaining that. I mean, I think that it's hard for anybody who is not in a situation where you have been told that you're terminal to understand how you begin thinking about thinking differently about death, thinking differently about, what are my goals, or what are the things that I want to see happen. And where I always come back to is, Jesus said the three greatest things are faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of things is love. And like you said, suffering, when you love somebody that's incompatible with suffering, you don't want them to suffer. I think as a parent, the worst possible thing that could happen, and you'll see my children jumping in the background because they're that active. As a parent, you rush to relieve suffering. If your child falls down, you rush to them. You're trying to take away those things. And I don't think that God or higher power, or whoever you want to style that as, if you believe in a benevolent higher power, I don't think that it is consistent with that belief that higher power would want you to suffer. So thank you for explaining that. And I've had a lot of conversations, my dad, who's a pastor, we've had a lot of conversations about that. Because you look differently at the world when you know that you have something that is going to end your life. So thank you for that explanation, Matt. I am sure that there are people who would not seek out something like Compassionate Choices if they had that perspective. But how many states is it now that medical aid in dying is even a possibility?
Yeah, so it's 11 jurisdictions right now. So it is, and being debated in over 20 right now, where these conversations are going on. So it is something that is spreading. When I started at Compassionate Choices, there were 3. And it is something that is continuing to happen again as people are coming out to these conversations, and as we're seeing examples of people who are courageously talking about it. People like you, Abigail, and people who are willing to speak on those pieces, and that generation of people that Dee Dee spoke about, who are now seeing their loved ones pass, and who are going like, is everybody seeing what I'm seeing? And through community are able to kind of come forward and advocate for these pieces.
And there are people in your network who actually move to places where medical aid in dying is possible when they are diagnosed with something serious, like say a glioblastoma, an inoperable brain tumor, or something of that nature.
Well, exactly. We saw the very widely publicized story of Brittany Menard, who moved from California to Oregon when she had a glioblastoma to access medical aid in dying. But what we're seeing even more so is people who are not terminal, deciding that the places where they want to spend kind of their later years, that this is a piece that comes into that decision. I've met several people who have moved to Oregon and said, we moved there, because we love rainy weather, and also because this is a place where this option exists. But it's a conversation that comes up often. Again, for this generation of people who are saying, I have lived with such intention. I chose my career. I chose how many children I wanted to have, where I wanted to live. I worked hard to make sure that I lived a life that was in line with my values and that I could be proud of. And I want to make sure that I'm not approaching the end of my life and suddenly relegating that to somebody else. And so, again, they are saying, well, if that means living in California, by God, I'll live in California. If that means moving to Vermont, I'll move to Vermont, because I want to make sure I have everything at my disposal when that time comes. And those also happen to be the people who are having these conversations with their family members, who are making sure that they have all this lined up, who before they move into a retirement community, make sure that the medical staff there are comfortable with these pieces. All of those things are, again, becoming more self-evident to a whole generation of people. And I couldn't be happier about it, because I think it flows downhill. A society that embraces those conversations is also a society that embraces life and that lives, again, intentionally more loving and things like that. So I think that we are seeing that, and in the time of COVID, more and more of those conversations occurring as well.
I think I read a statistic that after medical aid in dying became legalized in, I think it was Washington, D.C., it was a period of many years before anybody actually took advantage of it. So this idea of it becomes legal and all of a sudden the floodgates open and all these people are taking advantage of it, that hasn't turned out to be true. Is that correct, Matt?
That is so correct. We had a little bit of that in California when the law took effect, but that was because there was a 9-month period or so before it became effective after the law was passed. So there were people who had been waiting, had been having conversations through those 9 months. But, it's not a floodgates opening up and people going through this process. And in fact, in Oregon, not only is it that people who actually get the medication, a full third end up not taking the medication. And it's a very small percentage of people who can get the medication. But there was a study done by Linda Ganzini, who's a great psychological researcher here at the medical school. And she found that based on some conversations with family members, that 1 out of every 25 requests actually ended in the person getting a prescription. 24 out of those 25, the conversation, the open, honest conversation that came from that was enough to palliate the person's concerns, for them to feel more comfortable. So for those 24 out of 25, that might have been the first time that they had an open, honest, transparent dialogue about what it is that's important to them, what it is that they fear, how their symptoms are being managed. And that was what they cited. There were people who said, I think I want medical aid in dying because I don't want to have to leave my home. And the physicians would say, well, we can work on that. There are resources. Like, if you want to go through with this, let's do that. But if that's the motivation, let's talk about how it is that we can support you at home. Or a person who said, well, I saw my family member die from bone cancer, and it was incredibly traumatic for me. And then the doctor said, well, you don't have bone cancer. Let's talk about what end stage for your illness looks like. And came to find out that it was very different. All of those kind of deep conversations, really vulnerable conversations, were taking place. And physicians were citing those as some of the most meaningful conversations they've ever had, where they were able to be vulnerable as well. It became kind of this two-way human street that was going on. So in places where this law passes, as we often say, no more people will die because the law is in effect, but fewer people will suffer. And it's not just because of people are receiving medication that they can take at the end of their life. It's because people have permission to say, I am scared, and here are my concerns. And like I said at the beginning, how can we work backwards from that place of fear to a place of feeling like you have some power?
Around this medical aid in dying conversation, is there a way to predict, for those of us with metastatic breast cancer who are confronted with some of these choices, how do we know the extent to which it's going to be, quote unquote, like a hard death? How do we know whether or not we are going to suffer, to want to already set up in advance some of these medical aid and dying opportunities? And then the second part of that is, what is the timeline for that? I understand that in different states, it could take a couple of months to set up that type of care. And it's Is it, or is it not something that's covered by insurance?
Yeah. So as far as metastatic breast cancer and looking ahead to what kind of symptoms might happen because of whatever type of metastases you have, and then what that might look like in terms of the end of life. Unfortunately, that is one of those very, very, very specific questions, specific to you, specific to your experience. I'm reminded of, we had a discussion in the bone mets only group. I have only bone mets at this point, and just the wide variety of people who experience pain. I might have mets in the exact same place as somebody else, but for me, it's painful. For that other person, it's not. The same with honestly every other type of metastases. I know people who have brain mets who have very few symptoms because of exactly where their brain mets are. And then I know other people whose personalities are entirely different. And so unfortunately, I wish there was a one size fits all. You have metastatic breast cancer, you have these mets, this is what your death is going to be like. I wish there was a way to predict those things, but that, I believe, is an ongoing conversation with your medical oncologist, with your pain management doctor, with your hospice doctor, with your palliative doctor. These are the types of conversations that your doctor should be able to give you some direction for, and then also discuss what are the remedies in that particular situation. For instance, I've already talked to my palliative doctor about the fact that I don't want morphine. I don't want to be doped up on narcotics. I use medical cannabis to manage pain, to manage other side effects. She knows that's my perspective, that's my bent, that's my bias. And so just like Dee Dee and Matt have been talking about, I've had those conversations with my doctors, so they know what to suggest. They know kind of what category to pull out options from their toolbox, because they know the box where I fit in, or they know what the things are that are important to me. Like Matt was talking about, decisions that somebody makes in Georgia might be very different from somebody on the West Coast in terms of what options they're going to look at. So I hope that's helpful in terms of that particular question. But the other piece of, when do you get all of this stuff in place? The answer is now. The answer is when you're thinking about it, do it right now. Anna Spencer, who is our estate planning attorney, talked a lot about, you make these decisions, you make these arrangements when things are calm. You think these things through when you aren't in a crisis, when there's not chaos, when you're feeling well. You think about, you envision your ideal.
Envisioning your ideal. I love that. Thank you, Abigail and Matt, for taking this opportunity for a little excerpt to go into medical aid and dying. I feel like we just scratched the surface, and so we can definitely expect some more on this topic coming out in future episodes, also on Future Fridays and on our blogs at survivingbreastcancer.org. We look forward to continuing our webinar series. It happens every 2 weeks, where we bring Abigail and some guest speakers on our show. You can check out the full lineup at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Thank you for tuning in and listening to our podcast. If you would like to find out more about our organization and upcoming events and ways to connect, you can find out more by visiting our website at survivingbreastcancer.org. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences, and it is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always consult your medical care team. If you're looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, feel free to contact me directly at laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. And of course, we have a couple social media handles you can follow us at as well. For example, survivingbreastcancer.org, all one word, as well as our podcast specifically, Breast Cancer Conversations. Until next time, keep on thriving.